Oh,
So he's not paralyzed, but they're talking surgery, so.
okay. We're praying for him. All right. Any others this morning?
Country.
Yeah. Yeah.
School.
Yeah. It's coming, ain't it? Coming quick.
August 3rd, I'll be going back.
Yeah. All right. All right. Brother Tony, you mind praying for us this morning?
Father, we thank you so much, God, for the opportunity you give us, Father, to come and share your word. Father, we just ask today, Father, that you speak to us, Father, you would open our hearts. We pray, Father, that you would bless Jason this morning as we go through your word. Father, we lift up this morning these prayer requests, God. Father, things are real easy for you to fix, God, and I think, Father, you're looking for us, Father, to just have faith in you, that your will is done. God, we lift these up and ask that you bless as you see fit to. And God, we give you honor and glory and praise for everything that you do. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Tony. Again, we're in the book of Hosea this morning. Finished up Ruth last week. I really enjoyed studying Ruth with you guys and teaching that. And the book of Hosea is similar. He's got a story of his own, unlike any other story in the Bible. If you hadn't really been into Hosea, just know that it's a story of sin, of salvation, of judgment, and redemption. Kind of like our story, right? Sin and salvation and judgment and redemption. It's set. The set of this story here is Hosea's marriage, and Hosea's marriage and his wife. Her name is Gomer, and Gomer broke their marital covenant. And what's so strange about this is that it's not like Hosea was caught off guard. We'll find out that he knew all along that Gomer would break their covenant together, and God used their relationship, Hosea and Gomer. He used their relationship to illustrate to Israel how Israel had gone against God, had stepped out of the marriage with God, and they entered into this sacred covenant with God way back in Abraham, and they had broken their faith by committing spiritual adultery against God. Israel had done that. And their actions broke the heart of God. Israel's sin brought judgment, just like Hosea's wife. She had to suffer for her waywardness. But this book also will demonstrate to us that God has a heart for forgiveness and that God has a heart for reconciliation. And at the end of the day, God's goal in our marriages, in our relationships, at our jobs, and with Him is reconciliation. That's what God wants through all of that. And God demonstrated this through Hosea, and He told Hosea, I know what your wife has done, but I want you to welcome her back, even though she had been unfaithful to him. And through the actions of Hosea, God was saying to Israel that I will welcome you back if you'll turn from your ways. If you'll turn from your idols and turn from all these things you're doing, I will welcome you back. And He would forgive His people. Hosea teaches that God will not allow His people to become unfaithful to Him without consequences. Can I say this morning, God will forgive you for your sins, but there are consequences that will go with our sins. There are consequences and things that come from that. And just like a husband and wife expect faithfulness of one another in their marriage, God expects a full-time commitment from His people. And so my goal today is to read chapters 1 through 3. 1's a short chapter, 2's a kind of long chapter, and 3 is a very, very short chapter. But that'll get us through kind of this first cycle, this first rotation here. But I'm just going to read a chapter at a time, and then we'll go back and dive into it just in case we don't get that far. But Hosea chapter 1, verse 1, the word of the Lord that came unto Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. The beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said to Hosea, Go, take unto thee a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, which conceived and bare him a son. And the Lord said unto him, Call his name Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. And it shall come to pass at that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. And she conceived again and bare a daughter. And God said unto him, Call her name Lo-ruhamah, for I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. But I will have mercy upon the house of Judah, and will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by bow, nor sword, nor battle, by horses, nor by horsemen. Now when she had weaned Lo-ruhamah, she conceived and bare a son. And then said God, Call his name Lo-ammi, for ye are not my people, and I will not be your God. Imagine being told that by God. Imagine this man standing there, a prophet, during a rough time. The tribes there, the tribes were divided into Israel and Judah, right? And Hosea is primarily teaching or prophesying to the people of Judah, but he also has a little piece of Israel here. Verse 10, Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, Ye are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, Ye are the sons of the living God. Then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together and appoint themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. Now, this name, Hosea, all the way back in verse 1, Hosea in the Hebrew verb means to save or to deliver. And Hosea's message here is an offer of salvation and deliverance to those of Israel and Judah who would receive it. Problem being for Hosea, and the problem being for many people in the church today, is that his message fell on deaf ears. Nobody was willing to hear what Hosea had to say. Nobody was willing to understand it. And now when God called Hosea, he not only gave him a message, but he called him to be a message. You are a message to somebody in the way you live your life. Maybe a good message, it may be a bad message, but you are a message to somebody in your life. I even tell middle school students, somebody looks up to you. And so definitely for us adults, somebody in our life, it may be a coworker, it may be a spouse, it may be a child, somebody is looking up to us in the way we live our life. And he's telling him here in verse 2, I'm not going to just give you a message, but I want you to be a message. And Hosea's like, all right, cool, I get to be a message. And he says, go and marry a prostitute. Ouch. Really, God? Not only that, her name's Gomer. Marry a woman named Gomer. And he says, I want you to have children by this woman. Now, this is not your typical call into prophetic ministry, right? If we study all the prophets, this is not how God typically had called prophets. I mean, the Lord had a stance against sexual immorality, against adultery, against prostitution. He took a stance against this, and so this is a shocking command that God would tell him to do this, but there's a serious directive here behind what God was saying that we see in verse 2. He says, I want you to go and do this. I want you to go marry this woman who is living a promiscuous life, and I want you to have children by this woman. And he says, I want you to do this because the land, Israel, has committed the same thing and has departed from God. Frequently, we see in the Old Testament, when we see adultery and when we see prostitution, it's used as a metaphor for Israel turning away from God. That's the way it's used. Now, the Lord was Israel's husband, and Israel was the bride. And so for Israel to worship a false god and to bow to worthless idols It was the same as committing sexual immorality against her husband who had saved him. Y'all understand this? It's kind of a parallel story here. God stepped up to be the husband of Israel, to take care of Israel, to do what Israel needed, and the way Israel repaid him was to step out on God and turn to these idols. And so because God's bride was unfaithful, Hosea was to take an unfaithful bride for himself. What a calling on a man to have to do that. He went and he married Gomer, and she had a son. Now, don't overlook Hosea's full obedience to God. I mean full 100% sold out to God. God, whatever you want me to do, I'll do it. God, whatever it is here, I'll do it. He submitted himself and he submitted his family to be an object lesson for Israel, for the greater good, for the greater kingdom, because he would experience firsthand what it means and how it feels to love somebody who's unfaithful. He would experience this firsthand, but in the long run, Hosea would become more passionate about God. In the long run, Hosea would become more passionate about his wife. He would become more passionate about Israel as a result of all this. Now, God told Hosea in verse 4 and 5, he said, I want you to name your son Jezreel. Now, this term is symbolic of the judgment that would come upon Israel for their sin. That's what the name represents. And in 4 and 5, he talks about just like Jehu put the family members of the house of Ahab to death in Jezreel, God was going to put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. He's going to put a stop to it. Israel, you've walked out on me long enough, and I'm done with it. I've seen it, I know it's happening, and I'm done with it. The second child, verse 6 and 7, was a daughter, and she was given a name. Her name means no compassion. Imagine having a kid and naming it no compassion. What kind of child are you fixing to raise here? No compassion. It's a name that would make people take a double take. When people heard the name of this child, they're like, what in the world, Hosea? What are you doing? This name indicated that God is no longer going to have compassion on the house of Israel. Why? Because of their sin and because of their adultery spiritually. And for those who participate in sin, sin has consequences like we've talked about. But unlike Israel, though, Judah, remember we got two tribes here, both of God, Israel and Judah. They split when the tribes split after crossing, after going to the promised land, they split. And so Judah would experience compassion and deliverance, but Israel would not. Israel's mistake was failing to understand the source of their past deliverance. I would say today that our mistake is failing to understand where God's grace comes into our life. It's failing to understand just how good God's been to us. I wouldn't ask you to raise your hand, but I want you to think about this question. How many of us in this room have committed spiritual adultery against God in one way or the other? Everybody in here. Everybody in here. Everybody in here has stepped into a relationship with God, and maybe even for a split moment you stepped away from God. Maybe it was something you said, maybe it's something you watched, maybe it was something you did. Everybody in here has stepped away from God. Everybody in here has displeased God in something that we've done. It's common sense that we've all done that. Hosea's third child, verse 8 and 9, was given a name that meant not my people. This is God saying, I am rejecting Israel. But why? In verse 9, because they have rejected me. I'm rejecting Israel because Israel's rejected me. Now, God delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt, right? When He done that and they crossed the Red Sea, He entered into a covenant with the people of Israel. He entered into a covenant that He promised that if they would keep His commands, that they would be His special people. We find that in Exodus 19. God said, you will be my people. I've delivered you from slavery. I've taken you away from Pharaoh. I've led you through the wilderness. I've led you across the Red Sea. If you will keep my commandments, you will be my people. And he gave them this covenant, and he entered into this covenant with them. But Israel forgot that blessing. Israel forgot that blessing. Man, we go to a revival, or we go on some mission trip or some camping trip, and man, it's just great. And man, we come back steamed up, charged up, ready to go for God. 2 weeks later, we're back in our old ways again. That's me anyway. I don't know anybody else. But sometimes we just forget where our blessings come from. We forget where that was. But here's what they also forgot, that God's covenant was based on their obedience. God's covenant was based on their obedience. He says, I told you I would take care of you. I told you I would be here for you. I told you I would be your husband as long as you followed my commandments, as long as you stuck to our covenant. But Israel, you walked out on our covenant. You chose to go a different route. And so because of that, there's going to be consequences. Now, with this revelation that they're getting now, Hosea turns to a message of hope. In verse 10 and 11, we see Hosea, he turns this around into a message of hope, and he says, our present circumstances stunk. Our present circumstances are terrible. But Hosea says, let's look to a future day where the number of Israelites are like the sand of the sea, and they can't be counted and they can't be numbered, and instead of being told you are not my people, they will be called sons of God, verse 10. Not only that, but Israel and Judah will be united under a single head. One head, verse 11 tells us that. And that suggests that God, he brings judgment in part so he can bring blessing. He wounds so he can heal. I don't think my daddy ever whooped me out of hatred. I don't think he ever whooped me out of bitterness or meanness. I think he always done it to correct me. Why? Because he loved me. He wounded me so he could heal me. Right? God's the same way. He's going to take you where you need to be so he can heal you and make you a better person and bring you up to be better. Let's read chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 1. Say ye unto your brethren, Amma, and to your sisters, Ruhamah, plead with your mother, plead. Now, this looks like God is telling Hosea's kids what to do in this personal relationship. But this is God talking to Israel, his wife. So as we read this, y'all look at it that way. The mother being Israel. Plead. He's talking to Hosea here. Plead with your mother, plead. For she is not my wife, neither am I her husband. Let her therefore put away her whoredoms out of her sight, and her adulteries from between her breasts, lest I stripped her naked, and set her as in the day that she was born, and make her as a wilderness, and set her like a dry land, and slay her with thirst. And I will not have mercy upon her children, for they be the children of whoredoms. For their mother hath played the harlot. She that conceived them hath done shamefully, for she said, I will go after my lovers that give me my bread, and my water, and my wool, and my flax, mine oil, and my drink. Therefore, behold, I will hedge up thy way with thorns, and make a wall, that she shall not find her path. And she shall follow after her lovers, but she shall not overtake them. She shall seek them, but she shall not find them. Then shall she say, I will go and return to my first husband, for then it was better with me than now. For she did not know that I gave her corn and wine and oil, and multiplied her silver and gold, which they prepared for Baal. Therefore will I return and take away my corn in time thereof, and my wine in the season thereof, and will recover my wool and my flax given to her to cover her nakedness. And now will I discover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and none shall deliver her out of my hand. I will also cause her mirth to cease, and her feast days, and new moons, and her Sabbaths, and all her solemn feasts. And I will destroy her vines and her fig trees, whereof she has said, These are my rewards that my lovers have given me, and I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall eat them. And I will visit upon her the days of Balaam, wherein she burned incense to them, and she decked herself with earrings and jewels. She went after her lovers and forgot me, saith the Lord. Therefore, behold, I will allure her. He just talked about Israel's adultery. Now he's going to talk about Israel's restoration here. Therefore, behold, I will allure her, and I'll bring her into the wilderness and speak comfortably unto her. And I will give her vineyards from thence in the valley of Achor for the door of hope, and she shall sing there as in the days of her youth, and as in the day when she came up out of the land of Egypt. And it shall be at that day, saith the Lord, that thou shalt call me Ishi, and shalt call me no more Baal. For I will take away the names of Balaam out of her mouth, and they shall no more be remembered by their name. And in that day will I make a covenant for them with the beast of the field, with the fowls of heaven, and with the creeping things of the ground, and I will break the bow and the sword, and the battle out of the earth, and will make them to lie down safely. And I will betroth thee under me forever. Yea, I will betroth thee unto me in righteousness and judgment and loving kindness and in mercies. I will even betroth thee unto me in faithfulness, and thou shalt know the Lord. And it shall come to pass in that day I will hear, saith the Lord, I will hear the heavens, and they shall hear the earth, and the earth shall hear the corn and the wine and the oil, and they shall hear Jezreel. And I will sow her unto me in the earth, and I will have mercy upon her that had not obtained mercy, and I will say unto them which were not my people, thou art my people, and they shall say, thou art my God. Now, chapter 2 here, the Lord is telling the people of Israel to rebuke your mother. You go let Israel, the leadership of Israel, know that they're doing wrong. You go let everybody who's leading this know they're doing wrong. God says, you're not my wife and I'm not your husband. This marriage is over and the divorce proceedings are beginning. That's where they're at right here. Now, if Israel will not turn from their whoredom and from their promiscuous ways and their idolatrous ways and their adulterous ways, and God's going to make them weak, and God's going to make them desolate, and all the people will suffer. So what we see in verse 4. Verse 5 through 8, we see that as a prostitute has lovers who meet her economic needs, Israel worshiped false gods that they assumed were meeting their own needs. But God was going to prevent them from pursuing those idols. God was going to prevent them from doing these things so that they might return to Him. They didn't realize that it was God meeting their needs all along, not the ones they was cheating on God with. It was God alone who was doing things for them, not this idol they were worshiping, not this false god, not this boyfriend or girlfriend, however you want to look at that. It was not that. It was God that was still meeting their needs. It was God that gave them wealth. It was God that done all these things. God gave them all this stuff, and what did they do with it? They turned around and they gave it to Baal. God was the one taking care of them, and they turned it around and gave it to their boyfriend. Now imagine the feeling of God doing what He was doing, trying to help the people of Israel, and they took all the blessings from God and they gave them to a false god. Imagine Hosea working his tail off, right? Just working all the time, and Gomer's taking all the money out of the bank account and giving it to the one she's running around with or whatever, right? That's the same situation here that God's talking about. They're giving it to Baal. Verse 9 through 13, by following after Baal, Israel had basically thanked and worshiped the wrong God. They had turned to the wrong God, and the Lord was going to end their harvest. He says, all right, I'm cutting you off. I'm cutting off the bank account. I'm cutting off the groceries. I'm cutting off the celebrations, the parties. Israel's going to beg their idols to turn their blessings back on. God turned all this stuff off. God stopped all the celebrations and all the feasts and all that stuff is what we read in here, verse 9 through 11. But what does Israel do? They don't go to God and say, turn it back on. Their minds are so warped right now. They go to their boyfriend and say, turn it back on. To the god of Baal that they're cheating with and say, turn it back on. And they forgot. They didn't get an answer when they asked Baal to turn it back on. They enjoyed this illicit affair. They enjoyed all the things that come with this affair, but they forgot the husband who provided for them every single comfort they ever had. They forgot the husband that done everything for them. And verse 13 says, a day of reckoning is coming because of that. You're gonna pay the consequences for that. Verse 14 through 17, though, the tides turn. God, He expresses love and compassion towards His people through Hosea. He says, I know what you've done. It's wrong, but I still love you. He stands ready to forgive them. Verse 14, look at verse 14. He said, I will allure her or persuade her. I will bring her in the wilderness. I will speak comfortably. I will speak tenderly to her. You've done me wrong, Israel, but I'm not going to treat you bad. I still love you, Israel. I still want you, Israel. And he just comes back, and that's how he comes back at them. He's going to restore their fortunes. He's going to take them back to the days when they were first married. Verse 15 says, I'm going to take you back to the days when you come out of the land of Egypt. And you can rejoice in the God who saved you. Verse 16 says that basically says they're going to come to their senses, right? They're going to come back to where they need to be, and they're going to repent, and they're going to call on the Lord, and they're going to call God your husband because that's who He was. And I like this. Verse 17 says the names of the false gods will basically be no more remembered. We'll never speak that name again. That name don't matter anymore. That name was worthless in the first place. And that name's worthless today. Here's what I want you to see. You can't outrun the love of God. You cannot outrun the love of God. I don't care how much you've cheated on Him. I don't care how far you've ran from Him. I don't care how much you've worshiped other things instead of Him. You can't outrun the love of God. You can't. You can try your best. You cannot outrun the love of God. Verse 18 through 23, this is God. He's saying, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to allow you to rest securely. Man, there's nothing like having to look over your shoulder everywhere you go. Man, I used to tell folks who I would arrest for drug charges and stuff, I'm like, man, aren't you tired of running around looking over your shoulder everywhere you go, worried about somebody getting you or messing with you? Don't you want to get out of that life? Man, there's got to be some peace in being able to rest securely. There's got to be some peace. Verse 18, where you can lie down safely is what the end of that verse says. Man, what a feeling to lay down at night and not have to worry about anything. Not have to worry about me getting caught up with my boyfriend, right? That's where Israel's at. Not having to worry about cheating on my husband, God. Israel is going to bring safety to you. You're going to feel better when you take this step. You're going to enjoy life. Verse 19, he says, I'm going to take you to be my wife. Verse 19, I'm sorry. I'm going to take you to be my wife forever. I'm going to bring you unto me, and you'll be mine. He's going to take that compassion that he didn't have, and he's going to give it to him. Look at verse 23. He said, I'm going to say unto them which were not my people, you are my people. And they shall say, thou art my God. What a day that was and will be when we all come to that with God. It kind of reminds you of the prodigal son story, right? We've never gone too far. Don't ever think you can't experience a reversal of your situation. Please don't ever think that. I don't care if it's in your personal relationships. I don't care if it's in your at your job. I don't care what it is. If it's in your life and spiritually with God, don't ever think you've come too far to get right with people or with God. God can turn a bad situation around. Trust me. He can turn it around. He can restore you. He can redeem you. He can redeem your situations. Let's watch chapter 3. Let's read chapter 3 right quick. And it's 5 verses, but this is so important to what happens here with Hosea and Gomer. God just spoke through Hosea everything I read in chapter 2 on the people of Israel. Gomer has physically ran off on Hosea. She has gotten herself so deep in a bad situation that she can't get out. Gomer has turned back to her life of whoredom. She has turned back to her life of stepping out on her husband, and she's got herself in a fix. And she can't get out of it. And here's what happens here. Then said the Lord unto me, Go yet, love a woman beloved of her friend, yet an adulteress, according to the love of the Lord toward the children of Israel, who look to other gods and love flagons of wine. He says, you go get her. He said, your wife has stepped out on you, and your wife has found herself in a bad spot. Go get her. So I bought her to me for 15 pieces of silver, and for a homer of barley, and half homer of barley. And I said unto her, Thou shalt abide for me many days. Thou shalt not play the harlot, and thou shalt not be for another man. So will I also be for thee. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king, and without a prince, and without a sacrifice, and without an image, and without an ephod, and without a teraphim. Afterwards shall the children of Israel return and seek the Lord their God, and David their king, and shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. Hey, we don't know how long Hosea and Gomer had been married. We don't have a clue how long they had been married. Yet she had obviously forsaken their marriage vows. At some point in that marriage, she stepped out on their marriage, and she went and done something she shouldn't have done. And God says, I want you to go and get her. He says, I want you to go, and I want you to show love to this woman who's loved by another man. This woman who's an adulteress, I want you to go and love her. How could God expect Hosea to go and love a woman who betrayed him? Seems like a tough question, but it's not. Because the Lord, He says in verse 1, I love the Israelites